My wife lied to me for months, letting her powdered sugar addict ex-boyfriend secretly move in with us and pretending he was her brother. After piecing together her lies, I exposed everything to her family, setting off an explosive confrontation that led not just to the end of my marriage, but to her losing almost everything. I'm Daniel, 32M, and I was married to my wife, whom I'll call Julia, 28F, for just over a year before everything fell apart. I know that's not very long, but trust me, there's a lot in this short time frame, so let's dive in. I first met Julia about 3 years ago. For her privacy, I'm using fake names here. Back then, she was completely new to the city and chasing a dream to become a Hollywood fashion designer. Her family was against her plans from the start. Her parents didn't trust the Hollywood scene and instead hoped she'd join the family business and work a steady, respectable job. But Julia was stubborn and passionate, so she moved out to California on her own, taking an internship at a fashion company to prove her point. I work in advertising, and part of my job involves partnering with fashion brands for ad campaigns. That's how Julia and I crossed paths. She was still learning, but her manager kept bringing her to meetings because she had an amazing attention to detail and was quick on her feet. Soon, Julia was the go-to for my company, and our business relationship turned naturally into a personal one. It was gradual, first just work meetings, then casual hangouts, and finally, full-on dates. I admired her so much for her energy and her refusal to give up, even after clashing with her family and nearly being disowned. She sacrificed a lot for her career, so I wanted to support her every step. Because her company had a strict no-dating policy with clients, we kept things hush-hush for a while. But after Julia secured a better, full-time job elsewhere, we no longer needed to hide our relationship. We soon moved in together and officially started dating in public. At the time, Julia hardly knew anyone in the city besides her coworkers, so she spent most of her free time with my friends. She fit in instantly, quick-witted, funny, and super sociable. It genuinely felt effortless being around her, and I never had any doubts about what we had. Fast forward 2 years, I proposed and she accepted. But she was nervous. Her parents weren't thrilled that she'd chosen such a scandalous career, and on top of that, I wasn't Christian like them. She'd always feared their reaction if she brought a non-Christian into the family. But I did my best to reassure her. First, I introduced Julia to my parents, who loved her. I also told her I'd do my part to smooth things over with her folks, but Julia insisted she would manage it on her own. She wanted her parents to come directly to the wedding, rather than have an awkward dinner together with my family beforehand. I trusted her on that. She knows them best, after all. As we planned the wedding, I wanted to respect her family traditions, but she said we could do it however we liked. Her parents made it in time for the big day. I was actually ready for tense, icy conversations, but they turned out to be warm and polite. Nothing like Julia's sharp descriptions of them as strict, conservative types. Even my own mom was surprised. Julia just brushed off the subject, changing it quickly whenever I brought it up. Right after the wedding, I asked if she wanted to visit her hometown, since she'd never returned after leaving for California. Julia said work was hectic and that she'd go when things calmed down. Then, about 5 months ago, I was sent to Tokyo for business, a trip that lasted a week. A day before I left, Julia surprised me by saying she'd be spending that week visiting her parents because she would be lonely if I was gone for so long. The sudden plan felt off to me, but I couldn't do anything about it since my trip was set. I figured she just missed her family. While away, things were distant between us. She was busy with her folks. I was busy exploring the city and working. When we both got back, I said I'd love to meet her family myself, since till then, I'd met only her parents briefly. But Julia was non-committal. Let's plan it another time, she said. A few weeks later, she brought up her brother, which completely blindsided me. She hadn't mentioned him before, only once during our dating, and then she just said they weren't close. When I noticed he wasn't at our wedding, she said they were distant and that he was busy with the family business. But now Julia revealed her brother's name was Marco. She told me he was gay and their conservative family had tried to fix him through therapy. When he didn't change, her parents disowned him. That was why, she said, her parents pinned their hopes on Julia taking over the family business. After being rejected, Marco turned to drugs, dropped into a deep addiction, and ended up in rehab. For these reasons, he'd missed our wedding. I was shocked she never told me all this before, but she just cried and said she was scared I'd judge her family. Apparently, on that recent hometown visit, she'd learned Marco was out of rehab and alone. as the family still refused any contact. Julia worried he'd relapse from isolation, so she'd invited him to California and asked, could he move in with us for a while? I agreed. We had a spare room that was mostly junk storage anyway. 2 weeks later, Marco moved in. He was a year younger than Julia, who was now acting like an ultra-protective big sister. Marco seemed shy and withdrawn, and hardly ever spoke to me. Most of the time, he stayed out of sight. Julia also changed. Her whole world now revolved around Marco. She was incessantly networking for job leads for him and fussing over his well-being. I told myself she was just looking out for her brother, but something wasn't quite right. Marco's behavior got suspicious, secretive, jittery, and almost evasive. I started to wonder if he was still using or hiding something worse. Last week, I asked Julia if we could finally visit her hometown. She dodged, saying she was too busy. Then she insisted I shouldn't let her parents know Marco was living with us because they'd never accept that I was supporting their disowned son. This made no sense. Her logic was backward, and her explanations started to seem ridiculous. But that wasn't the only red flag. Whenever I came into the living room or kitchen, Julia and Marco would abruptly stop or change the conversation, sometimes talking in hushed voices. When I asked Julia about it, she claimed they were discussing Marco's addiction struggles and he was too embarrassed to talk around me. I mentioned all this to a colleague who said maybe I was just jealous Julia's attention was now split. I'm doubting myself, wondering if I'm imagining things, but the situation feels shady as hell. I'm posting here for a neutral view. Am I missing something obvious? Please let me know if you need more details. I'll be around tonight to follow the comments. Update 1. Thanks so much for all your responses on my last post. Some messages really stood out. Guys who'd been cheated on, their wives passing off lovers as brothers. That shook me to my core. I realized it was possible Julia was lying about everything. Instead of blowing up immediately, I decided to do some digging. First, I checked Marco's ID. Honestly, I should have done that right away. Then, a few days after my post, I walked into the living room unexpectedly, where Julia and Marco were. I asked Marco how his job hunt was going. They both looked startled, as I usually didn't pry like that. Marco hesitated, then said he was talking to recruiters, but no luck yet. I told him a friend of mine needed a supervisor and that I'd be happy to refer Marco, so could I see his resume? Rather than being excited by a work lead, both Julia and Marco looked shocked. Julia jumped in, saying she'd send it soon, but I insisted on having it right then. That sealed my suspicions. After some back and forth, Marco finally sent me a digital copy of his resume. I opened it right there in front of both of them. Sure enough, while his first name was Marco, his last name was not Julia's maiden name. I pointed it out, asking about the mismatch. Julia quickly answered, since his family disowned him, he changed his surname. Yeah, not convincing. I now doubted whether they were siblings at all. Over the next week, I told Julia I was traveling near her hometown for business and suggested she join me. I intentionally gave her almost no notice so she could easily refuse. She immediately said she was busy, but she kept asking if I'd see her parents anyway. I lied and said no, maybe another time. Of course, there was no business trip. I went to her hometown specifically to meet her parents and get to the truth. I found their address on Julia's ID. When I arrived, I asked them not to mention to Julia that I was there, pretending I was planning a birthday surprise for her, which was coming up in a couple of days. They welcomed me warmly and were genuinely delighted. While talking, I loosened the conversation toward their parenting style. Were they really conservative, as Julia described? They laughed and said people always assumed that unfairly about them. Nothing about them seemed strict at all. Then I asked her father about the family business and who would succeed him. He mentioned his son, Ryan, from a previous marriage, was already effectively running things and would take over. Her mother looked uncomfortable, but her father volunteered more. I wanted to be fair between both my children. That's why I pushed Julia to join too. Renee and my wife worry Ryan would keep everything for himself, but I'll be fair with both. He mentioned being disappointed with Julia's career choice, but I mostly zoned out at the bombshell. Her brother is named Ryan, not Marco. I was in shock, wanting to vomit. I excused myself, saying we'd finish these conversations at her surprise party. I glimpsed Ryan in family photos, but didn't get to meet him. Before leaving, I reminded them not to tell Julia I'd visited. After seeing this, it was clear Marco wasn't family. He was her lover. I couldn't stand being around Julia after this, so I didn't go home after leaving her parents' house. She called, asking when I'd be back. I told her the trip was extended and I'd be home Thursday. The truth? I was in a hotel, making arrangements with a lawyer for divorce. I know Julia and Marco probably had their honeymoon period while I was away, but I didn't even care anymore. I just wanted to expose everything to her parents. Once that happened, I'd update you all again. Update 2. Now I'm officially divorced. Sorry it took a while, but I wanted to wrap everything up first. A lot of commenters said all the red flags were obvious and that I was foolish for not seeing it sooner. But while things felt weird in hindsight at the time, nothing stood out until they started piling up one after another after Marco moved in. So here's how I ended things. On Julia's birthday, Thursday, I had her parents come over. I got home that morning and tried to avoid Julia all day. She probably thought I forgot her birthday. In fact, she hugged me and asked for her birthday wishes, so I played along. She tried to get me to take her out that night, but I faked being tired and needing a nap. Really, I just felt sick thinking about the coming confrontation. About an hour later, I got a call from Julia's dad. They were nearly there. I rushed outside, telling Julia I was picking up a delivery. When her parents arrived, I led them inside. That moment, when Julia and Marco saw them, could not have been more explosive. Her parents stared in shock. Marco looked terrified. Julia looked at me, desperate for explanation. I feigned innocence, joking, "Oh, Ryan didn't make it? That would have made this so much easier." Her dad stared at her in disgust, demanding to know what Marco was doing in our house. Julia burst into tears. I told her parents, "Isn't Marco your son?" Julia begged me to stop. Marco tried to leave, but I made him sit. Her mother demanded answers, so I told them everything as plainly as possible. Julia and Marco froze while her parents stared at them with absolute loathing. Her father then explained that Marco was Julia's old college boyfriend, the longtime drug addict who leached off her. Bates stopped giving Julia money because she kept supporting Marco. Julia left home only because her parents wouldn't let her keep bankrolling him, so she moved here to work and keep funding him. When Marco's addiction spiraled, they sent him to rehab, hoping she'd move on. Apparently, after moving to California, Julia met and married me, and her parents thought she was finally over Marco. But now here he was, living in their son-in-law's house. I asked Julia if all of this had started up again during her recent hometown visit. She looked straight at me and said yes. She admitted hiding me from her family because she was terrified her past would come out. She told me she'd stopped loving Marco, but seeing him out of rehab, she fell back in. He pushed her to divorce me, but she held off until he'd found stable work, hence the charade. Since Julia wasn't close with her stepbrother Ryan, she claimed Marco was her brother to cover for him. Marco said he never liked the plan, but Julia insisted on it. Julia's dad was so furious, he grabbed Marco by the collar and literally dragged him out, while Julia pleaded for him to stop. I just watched in disbelief at how cold and calculating Julia had become. Her parents apologized to me. I told them not to be sorry. I told Julia I was filing for divorce and she needed to leave immediately. Julia didn't argue. She went to the bedroom and quietly packed. Her dad refused to take her with them. He just told Julia, "Marco cost you everything. Live with it." They left without her. Julia left soon after, head down, silent. I didn't know whether to feel good for finally humiliating her or to pity her for destroying her own life. A month ago, my lawyer called Julia to confirm where to send the divorce papers. Julia insisted on kicking them up in person. She arrived, barely read the terms, signed, and handed them back without a fight. Our hearing was quiet. She looked terrible throughout, agreed to my terms, and walked away. There was nothing for her to claim. Our rental, my modest savings. Since she was working, there was no alimony. Since I wanted peace, I didn't sue her for fraud or cheating. Our divorce was finalized, uncontested. Yesterday, Julia's mom called to check the divorce status. She was distraught, having heard that Marco went back to using drugs, and she feared her daughter would follow him into addiction and worse. She also told me Julia's father disowned her from the family will, so she can't funnel money to Marco. I can't believe Julia, once so smart and determined, risked and lost everything over Marco. If even someone as driven as her could be sucked into such a situation, it makes you question everyone. That's it for this story. I see this story as a powerful reminder of how little we can sometimes know the people closest to us, and how factors like blind love or misplaced loyalty can drive even the sharpest people to self-destruction. Here is a question for you. Do you think trust can ever fully recover in a relationship after such a betrayal? Or would you have handled the confrontation differently? Tell me what you would have done.